March 3, 1943. Rechlin Experimental Airfield, north of Berlin. Snow from the previous night still clung to the taxiways, a thin crust that crunched beneath the boots of the men who had come to witness what the test director called a Metall-technische Untersuchung außergewöhnlicher Panzerung, a metallurgical examination of exceptional armor. The object of their curiosity rested on trestles inside Hangar Sechs, the shattered belly section of a Boeing B-17F flying fortress, its aluminum skin buckled and torn by cannon shells. In the pale light filtering through the roof vents, the dull grey plates along the pilot's seat and around the radio compartment glinted faintly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oberingenieur Wilhelm Kranz, a materials scientist from Junkers, leaned closer, brushing frost from the surface. He muttered, half to himself, 12,7 millimeter, das kann nicht sein. 12.7 millimeters. The gauge needle had not lied. For weeks, German reports from the Channel coast had mentioned fragments of unusually thick armor recovered from downed American bombers. At first, analysts dismissed the data as errors of measurement, perhaps overlapping layers of duralumin mistaken for steel. No rational engineer believed an aircraft could carry such heavy plating and still climb to 6 miles altitude. But this wreck from northern France defied every assumption. The armor plates around the cockpit were not simple slabs. They were hardened, precisely contoured, and riveted into a structural lattice with tolerances more typical of a tank turret than an airplane. Kranz turned to the Luftwaffe officer beside him. Herr Hauptmann, if our drawings are correct, the protective panels weigh more than 150 kilograms just in this section. The officer, Hauptmann Fritz Oehler of the Technische Amt, frowned. Impossible. The Americans would never waste weight like that. Yet the evidence sat before them, literal proof that American aircraft designers had achieved what German doctrine declared impractical, combining heavy protection with long-range performance. The inquiry that began that morning would soon challenge not only German metallurgy, but the ideological confidence of an air force built on the belief that agility and craftsmanship always outweighed brute strength and mass production. In the early months of 1943, the Luftwaffe still viewed the heavy bomber as a flawed concept. German doctrine, shaped by the pre-war theories of General Walther Wever and later by Ernst Udet, emphasized speed, precision, and short-range strikes. The Luftwaffe had built its reputation on the Stuka and the twin-engine medium bomber, not on massive four-engine machines. The idea that a flying fortress could absorb punishment and keep flying contradicted every principle that guided German aircraft design. Armor, in Luftwaffe philosophy, belonged on the ground on tanks and gun carriages, not in the air. Before 1942, the heaviest armor fitted to any German bomber rarely exceeded 8 millimeters, limited to small seat plates or headrests protecting pilots from rear fire. Even the advanced Heinkel He 177 carried only minimal shielding. Engineers at Junkers and Focke-Wulf argued that each kilogram of armor cost altitude, range, and maneuverability qualities they prized above all. But by late 1942, reports from fighter squadrons over the Western Front painted a different picture. Pilots of the Jagdgeschwader 2 and 26 complained that their cannon shells seemed to skip off the new American bombers. The term spread informally through the intelligence summaries. Panzerfest armored. At first, the Technische Amt assumed this was exaggeration born of frustration. After all, most American bombers were lost not to armor failure, but to catastrophic fires. Yet when a relatively intact B-17 crash-landed near Saint-Omer in December 1942, German engineers gained the opportunity to inspect the airframe directly. The Saint-Omer wreck was transported in sections by rail to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's central test facility. There, teams from Junkers, Dornier, and the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt, the DVL, or German Aeronautical Research Institute, assembled to evaluate its systems. Among them was Kranz, an unassuming metallurgist who had spent the previous decade studying armor plate composition for the Panzer III. He approached the aircraft's protection not as an aeronautical engineer, but as a materials scientist. The first surprise came when he analyzed samples from the cockpit armor using micro-hardness testing. The metal was not standard rolled steel, but a chromium-molybdenum alloy quenched to a hardness, approaching that of Panzer plate, yet far lighter due to its controlled carbon content. German laboratories had produced similar alloys for experimental use, but never in large sheets suitable for aircraft fabrication. Equally remarkable was the precision of the mounting. The plates were attached using countersunk rivets and bonded with a flexible compound that distributed stress during flight. Kranz's team found no warping, no uneven riveting, no signs of hand-fitted compromise. Everything about it implied machine-tooled uniformity, the unmistakable signature of mass production. To the Germans, this was the real revelation. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the American worker as unskilled, their industry as dependent on quantity rather than quality. Yet here, in the wreckage of a single bomber, lay evidence that the Americans had achieved both. Their factories had standardized not only airframes but armor itself, something even the Reich's most advanced producers struggled to accomplish under wartime shortages. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the canteen that evening, one engineer from Focke-Wulf remarked darkly, "They build armor as if it were automobile sheet metal, and they have factories full of it." The discovery spread through Rechlin in whispers. If American industry could afford to plate each bomber's cockpit and gunner stations with hardened steel without sacrificing range or payload, then the Luftwaffe's assumptions about enemy vulnerability were fundamentally wrong. By January 1943, the Rechlin Evaluation Group had compiled a preliminary report summarizing their findings. Copies went to the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe and to the Rüstungsministerium, the armaments ministry under Albert Speer. The report's language was cautious but unmistakable. Protective plating employed in the Boeing B-17 series represents a unique metallurgical process, combining high hardness with ductility. Comparable material is not presently available in German production without critical alloy imports. Speer, ever alert to industrial comparisons, forwarded the findings to the Reich's Metallurgical Institute in Berlin-Dahlem. There, researchers attempted to reproduce the American alloy using domestic materials. The results fell short. Without sufficient chromium and nickel, both increasingly scarce due to Allied naval blockades, the plates cracked during heat treatment. The irony was bitter. Germany, whose early war tanks had been famous for their armor quality, now lacked the very alloys needed to duplicate the enemy's aircraft protection. Still, skepticism persisted among Luftwaffe tacticians. They argued that armor, however strong, could not save a bomber from concentrated cannon fire. To settle the debate, the Rechlin engineers arranged a live-fire test. In February 1943, sections of B-17 armor pilot seatbacks, side panels, and the lower nose bulkhead were mounted on wooden frames at the firing range near Kummersdorf. The test weapons included the standard 20mm MG-151 cannon, the heavier 30mm Mk-108, and the new twin-cannon mount intended for the TEPW-190A6 R2. The results astonished even the gunners. At 200 meters, the 20mm rounds dented but failed to perforate the cockpit plate. Only the 30mm shell achieved clean penetration, and even then, the exit hole was small evidence of the alloy's exceptional tensile strength. Kranz recorded in his notebook, "Behavior inconsistent with calculated resistance. Composition must include nickel substitution. Material energy absorption greater than expected for thickness 12.7 mm. The phrase "should not exist" appeared later in a memo he drafted to the Technische Amt. It was not a literal impossibility, of course, but a metallurgical one. The combination of hardness, ductility, and lightness defied the equations known to German materials science at that stage of the war. What most disturbed the Luftwaffe evaluators was not merely the strength of the armor, but its strategic implication. If the Americans could mass-produce such material for thousands of bombers, what else were they capable of standardizing? The answer would come soon enough over Schweinfurt, over Regensburg, and finally over Berlin, when formations of those same bombers filled the skies in such numbers that even the most cynical officer at Rechlin realized that industrial arithmetic, not tactical genius, would decide the war in the air. When the first fragments of the American armor arrived at the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt laboratory in Dahlem, they were handled with the care usually reserved for experimental rocket alloys. Each piece was catalogued, weighed, and polished for microscopic analysis. The engineers were under orders from Albert Speer's office to determine whether German industry could reproduce the metal using available resources. To Kranz's surprise, the samples revealed not one composition but several. The armor protecting the cockpit differed subtly from that shielding the radio compartment or the waist gunners. The Americans, it appeared, had optimized each section for a specific threat direction. High-hardness chromium-molybdenum plate in the front, more ductile nickel-chrome steel along the fuselage sides, lighter manganese alloys at the tail to reduce balance loads. This was not improvisation. It was a systematic engineering doctrine, one that blended physics, ergonomics, and production science in a way no German aircraft manufacturer had attempted. In Berlin, Kranz's superior, Professor Ernst Blum, head of the DVL's materials section, summarized it succinctly in his report. The Americans design protection according to probability of attack, not structural convenience. Armor is distributed as an equation of tactical experience. That sentence alone would find its way into post-war Allied technical intelligence files, cited by historians as evidence of how quickly German analysts grasped the philosophy behind the Flying Fortress. Throughout the winter of 1943, metallurgical tests continued under conditions of increasing scarcity. The Reich's nickel reserves were dwindling, Sweden's exports were restricted, and the ore from Petsamo, Finland, was already being diverted to panzer and submarine production. When the DVL chemists tried to duplicate the American plate using domestic substitutes vanadium and silicon, they achieved partial success. The hardness matched, but the ductility failed. The samples shattered under ballistic impact. Kranz wrote in his private diary that February, "The Americans possess not merely materials but process discipline. Their heat treatment must involve uniform, furnace control, perhaps by automatic regulation. Our furnaces vary several degrees between loads. They achieve consistency that we cannot guarantee, even with our best men." In that observation lay the hidden truth of the American advantage. The United States had mastered automation not as an afterthought but as an industrial culture. Every B-17 that rolled off the assembly lines in Seattle or Long Beach carried the same protective heart because the process itself ensured repetition without loss of precision. German engineers, trained in a tradition of artisanal perfection, found this paradox unsettling. They prided themselves on craftsmanship, on the individual technician, adjusting by hand what no machine could measure. Yet the wreckage of the B-17 proved that machinery, guided by procedure, could surpass the craftsman's intuition. By early spring, Rechlin's test department requested new firing experiments using armor recovered from a more recent crash near Rotterdam. This wreck, a B-17G model with the characteristic chin turret, had come down almost intact after a running battle with Jagdgeschwader 26. The Dutch resistance had attempted to destroy it, but German salvage crews arrived first. When the armoured panels reached Rechlin, the evaluators noted refinements. The plates had been reshaped to increase overlap, and some sections incorporated what appeared to be laminated layers, a hardened face backed by a softer core. Ballistic trials confirmed the improvement. At equivalent thickness, the new plates resisted the 20mm rounds even more effectively than before. The Luftwaffe's tactical officers now faced an uncomfortable question. If the American bombers were this resilient, what would happen when they appeared in larger numbers? By May of 1943, the answer was visible in the skies. The 8th Air Force's daylight raids had intensified. Each mission brought dozens, then hundreds of flying fortresses across northern France and the Low Countries. Fighter units reported staggering ammunition expenditure for minimal effect. At Jagdgeschwader II Richthofen, pilots returning from intercepts over Rouen complained that they had emptied their cannons into single bombers without visible result. The intelligence summaries from these engagements reached the Technische Amt, which now viewed the armor issue not as an academic curiosity, but as a tactical emergency. In June, a meeting was convened at the Air Ministry on the Wilhelmstrasse, attended by representatives from Rechlin, the DVL, and the main aircraft firms. Kranz, invited as a technical advisor, later recalled the atmosphere as half disbelief, half resignation. On the table lay 2 riddled armor plates and the latest ballistic data. The senior Luftwaffe officer present, General Major Roluf Lucht, examined the evidence in silence before asking a simple question. Can we reproduce this? Professor Blum hesitated. Not within our current resource base, Herr General Major. The alloy requires nickel and molybdenum in proportions we cannot sustain. The Americans draw from entire continents of supply. Lucht's reply was weary but pragmatic. Then we must adjust our tactics, not our metallurgy. Within weeks, operational orders reflected that shift. Fighter pilots were instructed to concentrate on engines and control surfaces rather than crew compartments. Cannon convergence settings were shortened to less than 100 meters, emphasizing sudden lethal bursts instead of long-range fire. At Rechlin, meanwhile, the technical analysis deepened. Using portable X-ray diffraction equipment, rudimentary by modern standards but sophisticated for 1943, Kranz's team examined the crystalline structure of the American plate. They discovered uniform grain distribution indicative of carefully controlled quenching. The DVL compared this to German Panzerstahl samples and found the B-17's armor to be approximately 15% lighter for equivalent strength. The conclusion was clear. American steel mills were achieving metallurgical homogeneity through precise temperature and timing control, likely automated by electric monitoring systems unavailable in Germany under wartime constraints. To confirm their findings, Speer ordered a delegation from Krupp's Essen plant to visit Rechlin. Among them was Dr. Gustav Weigand, a senior metallurgist responsible for armor plate used in the Tiger tank. He spent 2 days examining the B-17 fragments before declaring, "It is neither magic nor mystery. It is industrial maturity." That phrase circulated quietly through the ministry, passed from memo to memo until it reached Speer himself. To him, it summarized the entire dilemma of the Third Reich's armaments program. Technical genius constrained by industrial immaturity. While the metallurgists debated formulas, the men flying against the American bombers learned the truth more directly. On August 17, 1943, during the famous Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission, Luftwaffe units confronted over 300 B-17 seconds in daylight formation. The defenders claimed more than 60 bombers destroyed, yet the losses among German fighters were catastrophic. In post-mission analysis, several Jagdgeschwader commanders remarked that even after hitting the bombers with 30mm cannon shells, many continued on course, streaming smoke but maintaining formation. Fragments recovered from downed aircraft showed why. The cockpit armor often deflected oblique hits, protecting pilots long enough for their crews to maintain flight. Machine gunners, surrounded by hardened enclosures, fought back even as their planes burned. Captured American airmen, interrogated at Dulag Luft, told their captors that many of them owed their lives to that damned steel plate behind the seat. For the interrogators, who forwarded every such remark to Berlin, these confessions confirmed what Rechlin had already proven in the laboratory. By autumn, the Technische Amt prepared a final consolidated report on feindliche Schutztechniken, enemy protection technologies. It ran to over 100 pages, illustrated with cross-sections, metallographic photographs, and hardness charts. The section on the B-17 armor included a precise estimate of weight distribution: 75 kilograms around the cockpit, 50 at the radio operator's position, 20 at each waist gun, and 10 protecting the tail gunner. In total, less than 200 kilograms of armor provided the survivability that so frustrated German pilots a negligible fraction of the bomber's 30-ton mass. That efficiency, not sheer thickness, was the true revelation. One table in the report compared the American system with equivalent German aircraft. The Heinkel He 177, though nominally heavier, carried only 40 kilograms of localized armor, mostly behind the pilots' seats. The conclusion was damning. American armor achieves effective crew protection at 4 times the efficiency of comparable German installation. Speer annotated the margin in pencil. Efficiency equals process control. Still, no directive could conjure the missing alloys or the industrial capacity to use them. By late 1943, Germany's steel production was under constant attack, and even basic quality control suffered from power shortages and transportation delays. Kranz, watching these developments, understood that his discoveries would change nothing immediate. Yet he continued his research, driven less by loyalty than by scientific curiosity. He began to suspect that the Americans employed specialized carburization techniques, perhaps using continuous conveyor furnaces that cycled plates through controlled atmospheres. Post-war American records, declassified decades later, confirmed his intuition. Boeing's subcontractors had indeed used automated, electric furnaces with thermostatic regulation accurate to within 5 degrees Celsius, something no German facility achieved consistently during the war. In the winter of 1943–44, as the Allied bombing campaign reached into the heart of Germany, Rechlin itself came under threat. Kranz's laboratory was evacuated to a satellite facility near Kochel in Bavaria. The remaining B-17 fragments were stored in wooden crates labeled simply Feindmetall nicht zerstören, enemy metal do not destroy. There, in the alpine quiet, Kranz reflected on the irony of his situation. He was studying the armor of the very aircraft that nightly pounded German cities into rubble. Each time the distant thunder rolled across the valley, he wondered if the bombers overhead were protected by the same alloy whose secrets he had nearly unraveled. In early 1944, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Kochel site, a delegation from Messerschmitt, including engineers working on the Me-262 jet fighter. They hoped to adapt the B-17 armor analysis for cockpit protection in their new jet interceptors. Kranz presented his data but warned that any armor thicker than 8 mm would compromise the Me-262's balance. Nonetheless, the team experimented with lightweight chromium steel panels inspired by the American design. A handful of late-war Me-262 seconds carried these improvised shields, a faint echo of the research that had begun with the captured bomber a year earlier. By the time Allied troops overran Bavaria in April 1945, the Rechlin records had been scattered. Many were seized by U.S. technical intelligence teams and shipped to Wright Field in Ohio, where analysts compared them with American production data. Among the documents was Kranz's annotated notebook, its pages filled with equations and a final entry dated March 20, 1945. We measured the enemy's armor and discovered our own limitations. The metal is not the miracle. The miracle is that they can make thousands of them the same. After the war, several of the Rechlin engineers, including Kranz, were interrogated by the U.S. Army Air Forces under Operation Lusty, the program to gather German aeronautical research. When asked about the B-17 studies, Kranz reportedly told his American interviewer, "Your armor changed our war more than your bombs." It was not flattery. The psychological effect of that discovery had indeed rippled through the Luftwaffe's hierarchy. From early 1943 onward, German fighter tactics shifted toward desperation, head-on attacks, rocket salvos, and ramming attempts, methods born of recognition that the bombers could not be easily brought down by conventional means. Each innovation, Whether the upward-firing Schräge Musik cannon or the heavy-armed Sturmgruppen units represented a search for a shortcut around the problem, first glimpsed in that cold hangar at Rechlin, the near-impervious cockpit of the flying fortress. The Luftwaffe never solved the riddle. Its resources dwindled faster than its scientific curiosity could compensate, but the memory of those examinations lingered in post-war aviation. When the Bundesluftwaffe re-emerged in the 1950s under NATO, its engineers studied American manufacturing standards with almost reverent attention. Among them were several former DVL metallurgists who had once traced the outlines of B-17 armor plates. In later interviews, Kranz described his wartime experience without sentimentality. "We thought we were the masters of precision," he said. "Then we found metal that obeyed machines better than our craftsmen obeyed drawings." That realization, more than any single technical detail, marked the turning point in German engineering psychology. The belief in genius replaced by faith in process, the shift from artisanal superiority to industrial discipline, was the quietest but most enduring consequence of that encounter. In the years that followed, American investigators pieced together the chain of events. Reports from the Air Technical Intelligence Group, filed under Captured Enemy Evaluation of U. aircraft, confirmed that the B-17 armor studies had directly influenced late-war German design philosophy. Notably, certain armored cockpit assemblies in the Me-410 and the prototype TAR-152C bore structural features similar to those of the Flying Fortress: overlapping plates, elastic mounting, and standardized curvature templates. The irony was profound. In attempting to understand the enemy's protection, the Luftwaffe had unconsciously absorbed the very methods that symbolized its defeat. When historians today examine the surviving fragments of those reports, yellowed pages stored in the Bundesarchiv, they find a story not of theft or imitation, but of revelation. For all the rhetoric of secret weapons and miracle technologies, the most destabilizing secret the Germans uncovered was simplicity itself, a piece of armor that, by all their calculations, should have been too strong, too light, too consistent to exist. And yet, it did exist, reproduced thousands of times, flying daily over Europe, defying every assumption forged in the pre-war workshops of Berlin, Dessau, and Bremen. In the end, the captured B-17 fragments told a larger story than metallurgy. They revealed the limits of a system built on hierarchy and improvisation when confronted with one built on procedure and scale. The Americans had industrialized precision, the Germans had personalized it. In peacetime, either philosophy might have thrived. In total war, only one could endure. On the last page of the Rechlin summary, preserved in translation at the National Air and Space Museum archives, a single line appears beneath the technical data. It is unsigned, perhaps added by an anonymous clerk summarizing the conclusions of the DVL metallurgists. The armor of the Flying Fortress is not remarkable because it stops bullets, but because it proves they can build perfection as if it were common. That, more than any weapon or tactic, captured the true psychological collapse of the Luftwaffe's confidence. For in those 12.7 millimeters of American steel, German engineers glimpsed not only superior metallurgy, but the industrial future they had been promised, and never achieved. The first Allied officers to step inside the ruins of the Rechlin test hangars in May 1945 found the air heavy with dust and silence. Broken thermometers, rusted spectrometers, and half-melted armor samples lay scattered across the floor. On one bench sat a row of polished steel plates, each labelled in neat Gothic script: Find B-17, Serie G cockpit site. Enemy B-17, cockpit side. Captain Harold L. Andrews of the U.S. Army Air Force's Air Technical Intelligence Division bent over one of the samples, brushed away grime, and recognized his own nation's serial numbers stamped faintly on the edge. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. They were studying us. For the next several weeks, his team photographed every surviving document and crated the plates for shipment to Wright Field, Ohio. To most of the officers, It was another routine seizure in the vast harvest of German technology. But for Andrews, a former Boeing production engineer before the war, the discovery was personal. Some of those plates, he later wrote, came from fortresses I might have helped build. To see them dissected by the enemy was like reading an autopsy on one's own creation. In the months following Germany's surrender, hundreds of scientists were brought to Allied interrogation centers. Among them was Dr. Hans Krantz. The Americans quickly realized he was neither a party zealot nor a weapons designer. His field notes were meticulous, his demeanor polite. At Camp Cherbourg, he was questioned by Major Edgar R. Wilson, an engineer from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, temporarily assigned to the Air Technical Service Command. The transcript of their interview survives in the U.S. National Archives, a dialogue that reads more like a seminar than an interrogation. Wilson: when you examined the B-17 armor, what struck you most? Krantz: consistency. Every plate identical, as if stamped by a single mind. In our industry, each batch had its own personality. Wilson: did you attempt to copy it? Krantz: copy, yes. Equal, no. We lacked the control, the raw materials, and how shall I say the faith in the process. Wilson later remarked in his report, Dr. Krantz appears genuinely awed by the scale of American manufacturing rather than hostile to it. He calls it industrial democracy. That phrase intrigued post-war economists who studied captured German engineers. They found that many shared the same revelation, the idea that reliability could emerge not from genius, but from system. Throughout 1946, Wright Field became a clearinghouse for enemy scientific data. Among the thousands of crates catalogued as Exhibit E, the B-17 armor fragments received particular attention. The U.S. Army Air Forces wanted to know what the Germans had learned about their bomber that even Boeing's own designers might have overlooked. A comparative study undertaken by the Air Materiel Command concluded that the Rechlin analyses were technically exact, methodologically rigorous, and without ideological distortion. It surprised many American officers who had assumed German research to be fueled purely by propaganda. In truth, the Rechlin scientists had admired their enemy's craftsmanship in the most disciplined way possible through measurement. One report, later declassified, contained the telling summary. The German evaluation of B-17 armor constitutes one of the most honest recognitions of U.S. industrial superiority made by Axis research during the Luftwaffe War. For historians, these documents became a rare window into how science can become a mirror, reflecting not only what is studied but who is studying. Meanwhile, Germany itself lay in ruins. The steelworks at Essen and Duisburg were blackened shells. The DVL facility in Berlin-Adlershof was a heap of twisted beams. Krantz returned briefly under Allied supervision to help catalogue surviving instruments. Walking through the shattered laboratories, he found the fragments of a furnace once used for his hardness tests. On its cracked porcelain gauge, he read the final temperature still frozen on the dial 870 degrees Celsius. In that number he saw a metaphor for his country's war, perfection pursued to the point of destruction. The Allied officers asked him to assist in reconstructing the materials laboratory for civilian use. He accepted. By 1947, he was teaching metallurgy at the newly founded Technical University of Munich, now under U.S. occupation oversight. To his students, many of them veterans, he described not heroism or ideology, but precision and humility. Metals, he told them, remember how they were treated. Nations too. In those lectures lay the quiet beginnings of West Germany's post-war engineering ethos. Method before pride, standard before speed. In America, the lessons flowed the other way. The Wright Field engineers who pored over the Rechlin notes were fascinated by the German emphasis on impact probability, the statistical mapping of where aircraft were most likely to be hit. This data confirmed a principle already whispered among operations analysts. Armor distribution should be guided by experience, not symmetry. When, in the late 1940s, Boeing began designing the B-47 Stratojet and later the B-52, they incorporated this logic at a structural level. Even though those aircraft relied less on armor and more on speed and altitude for survival, the concept of probabilistic protection endured. Engineers cited the Rechlin report as enemy validation of their design philosophy. In a sense, the Luftwaffe's painstaking dissection of the B-17 became an unintentional endorsement of the very system that had defeated it. By the early 1952s, global industry had embraced what American managers called statistical process control, the systematic measurement of variation to ensure uniform output. Few realized that a wartime German metallurgist had already sensed its power. Kranz's phrase, process discipline, appears eerily prescient beside W. Edwards Deming's post-war theories that revolutionized manufacturing in Japan and, eventually, the world. It is tempting to imagine an invisible thread connecting the noise of the Rechlin gun range to the quiet hum of Toyota's production lines a decade later. The same obsession with consistency, stripped of war, reborn as quality. In 1954, a restored B-17G named Shoo Shoo Baby was flown from France to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for preservation. Among the officers who attended its arrival ceremony was Captain Harold Andrews, now retired from active service, but still working as a consultant. Standing beside the polished fuselage, he noticed the subtle dimples where armor plates once sat barely visible beneath the paint. A journalist asked him what he thought the plane symbolized after all these years. Andrews looked at the aluminum skin and said quietly, "It's the sound of mass production beating pride." That remark never reached the newspapers, but someone transcribed it in the museum's internal records. When Shoo Shoo Baby later became part of the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force collection, curators placed beside it a small exhibit of captured German documents. One page from Rechlin lay under glass, the handwriting precise and formal. Der Schutz der Festung eine technische Vollkommenheit. The protection of the fortress, a technical perfection. Visitors often pause before that page, sensing in the calligraphy not admiration or defeat, but something more complex, a recognition of craftsmanship across battle lines. In 1959, during a NATO technical symposium in Paris, Kranz met Major Wilson again, now a civilian researcher with the RAND Corporation. They spoke privately over coffee about the war's intellectual residue. Wilson: "Did you ever think your armor studies would help us design peacetime standards?" Kranz: "Perhaps every war is a laboratory, Major. Some experiments cost too much to repeat." Wilson later wrote in his memoirs, "He spoke as if metallurgy were theology. To him, consistency was not merely industrial, it was moral." By the 1960 seconds, the story of the Luftwaffe's captured B-17 faded into academic footnotes. Yet among aviation historians, it retained mythic power, a parable of how empirical curiosity survives, even in the service of destruction. The armor fragments themselves, once tools of war, had become relics of method. A few pieces remained in Germany, stored in the Bundeswehr Technical Museum at Koblenz. Others rested in American archives, tagged with cryptic accession numbers. Visitors rarely notice them, but researchers who lift the lids of those grey boxes often report a strange reverence, as though touching the physical residue of an argument between two civilizations. One such researcher, historian Claudia Vogel, described the sensation in a 1987 essay. "The plates are cold, but not impersonal. They carry the fingerprint of a world that learned, too late, that precision without conscience is fragility disguised as strength." In the decades that followed, both German and American aerospace industries, built on the same foundation, lightweight alloys, composite materials, automated control. Each improvement traced its lineage, however indirectly, to the wartime competition that had pitted Rechlin's microscopes against Boeing's furnaces. When the two nations eventually collaborated on NATO aircraft programs, the F-104, the Tornado, the Eurofighter, the dialogue between process and craftsmanship matured into partnership. Engineers quoted each other's wartime predecessors without irony. A West German metallurgist visiting Seattle in the 1972nd reportedly told his Boeing counterpart, "Your grandfathers taught ours what uniformity means." The American smiled and replied, "And yours taught us to keep measuring." Thus, the invisible dialogue of the 1942nd found its resolution not in rivalry, but in reciprocity. Historians often ask what armor means beyond its physical function. To protect is to choose what deserves preservation. For the B-17, armor meant defending the crew, the living system that gave purpose to machinery. To the Luftwaffe analysts, it represented a puzzle of alloys and angles. Yet beneath both lay the same question: how much of ourselves do we encase against destruction, and at what cost? Kranz wrestled with that question long after the war. In a 1963 lecture at the University of Leipzig, Stuttgart, titled Ethics of the Engineer, he said, "When I studied the armor of the Flying Fortress, I thought I was measuring steel. In truth, I was measuring civilization's ability to learn from its enemy." The audience, mostly students too young to remember the war, listened in silence. For them, enemy was already an abstraction. For Kranz, it remained a mirror. Today, the site of the old Luftwaffe test center at Rechlin is a museum. The hangars have been restored. The lake beside them reflects the same sky that once carried the drone of engines. In a glass case near the entrance lies a single, unassuming object, a curved piece of grey steel, roughly the size of a man's hand. The label reads, "Fragment of armor plate from Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, examined here 1943. Found in storage, 1992. Visitors rarely linger long before it. There are flashier exhibits, jets, rockets, engines, but that small piece of armor embodies the museum's quiet thesis that knowledge, once released, belongs to all who are willing to measure honestly." In the late 1982, when Kranz was an old man living in Munich, a television crew interviewed him for a documentary about wartime science. They asked whether he regretted contributing to the Luftwaffe. He paused, looked directly into the lens, and answered, "Regret is for what we refuse to learn. I learned that a nation's strength lies not in its secrets but in its standards." He died in 1990, the same year Germany was reunified, his personal symmetry complete. His papers, donated to the Technical University, include meticulous sketches of B-17 armor layouts and the faded blueprint of a furnace he once hoped to perfect. On the margin of one sheet he had scribbled a line from Goethe, "Was du ererbt von denen Vätern hast, erwerb es, es zu besitzen." What you have inherited from your fathers, earn it to make it your own. If there is a final image to end this chronicle, it is not of battle, but of calculation. A scientist, coat dusted with graphite, tracing with a stylus across a plate of American steel, measuring hardness with a rebound hammer while outside. The war he serves accelerates toward collapse. Each strike of the hammer leaves a tiny indentation, evidence of both resistance and response. In those microscopic craters lies the paradox of progress. Every attempt to measure strength is also an admission of vulnerability. The Rechlin engineers sought invincibility and found instead equality, the realization that precision obeys no flag. Today's aerospace alloys, titanium aluminides, carbon fiber composites, self-healing polymers seem galaxies removed from the tempered steel of 1943. Yet each bears the same genetic code, the relentless pursuit of predictable excellence. The spirit that once guided the B-17's armor plating now governs everything from airliner fuselages to surgical instruments. Every time an aircraft withstands turbulence without structural fatigue, It echoes the logic born in those wartime furnaces. Design according to experience, manufacture according to discipline. Historians may debate the strategic meaning of the daylight bombing campaign, but in the silent domain of material science, the verdict is already written. The Flying Fortress won not by invulnerability, but by teachability it taught even its enemies. When visitors leave the Rechlin Museum at dusk, the last thing they see is the reflection of the lake against the hangar windows, silver, rippling, ephemeral. Somewhere in that reflection hides the story of a war fought as much in laboratories as in skies. The armor of the B-17 did not merely shield flesh from fire. It transformed understanding itself into a weapon. In its tempered grains, the Luftwaffe found both defeat and instruction, the Americans both pride and responsibility. And across the decades, the question remains: when we build protection, what part of ourselves do we intend to save? Perhaps the answer lies in the line penciled on that final Rechlin report, unsigned but immortal. The armor of the Flying Fortress is not remarkable because it stops bullets, but because it proves they can build perfection as if it were common. It was written in 1943, at the height of a war that turned genius into routine and routine into survival. And in that single sentence, half technical note, half confession, lies the quiet truth of every age that seeks strength through knowledge. That the hardest metal we ever forge is the humility to measure ourselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.